Hi, I'm Ross Rosenberg. Welcome to my latest YouTube video and podcast. Today, I am excited because I get to talk to my friend, colleague, and incredibly talented psychotherapist and writer, Robert Jackman. We met a long time ago, and if you've listened to our other conversations, we got an interesting backstory. Before we get going, let me read his biography, and then we'll just jump right into a conversation. Robert is a best-selling author, inner child expert, and board-certified psychotherapist with the National Board of Certified Counselors, who has helped many people on their healing path in his private practice for over 25 years. He's a graduate of National Louis University, which are big and prestigious universities in the Northern Illinois area, Chicago area. His 4 books are read by over 100,000 people worldwide. See, I would have thought more, but I assume you're right, Bob. Our therapist recommended and translated into 11 languages. And in addition to his private practice, he has taught master level classes at NLU and has led outpatient groups and clinics in hospitals. He's an incredible psychotherapist, guys. He has been a guest speaker in international radio programs, numerous podcasts, panels, and telesummits on the topic of codependency, boundary setting, couples, communication, inner child work, grief, loss, mindfulness, and the role of spirituality and healing, and has participated in numerous retreats for victories for men. That's a lot. Bob, you're a busy guy. Wow. So it's nice to see you. And is this our 4th or our 3rd YouTube or podcast
I think it
collaboration?
might be more than 4 actually, Ross, but
Oh,
I'm always glad to be with you. We always have
yeah.
great discussions, and I'm looking forward to today's discussion as well.
I'm also really excited because no matter what the topic is, it's like the old times when we first met, we just start chatting and things
Mhm.
just get kind of easily carried away and we're off to the races with sharing ideas, thoughts,
Mhm.
and I always love the insights that you bring to my life. But one of the things that, if it's okay with you, I'd like to focus on is your wonderful, wonderful first book. If you can first introduce your book, that would be great.
I sure will. So my first book is called Healing Your Lost Inner Child. So
Hmm.
there's a book and a workbook. And the
Yeah.
main focus of that book is about helping folks understand their wounded responses that originated in childhood and that
Hmm.
they've carried into adulthood. And so it's the first part of the book begins by identifying, how these wounded responses come about and what they look like. And so what I'm talking about is when people will shut down or they will get really big or they'll make other people more important for them, giving their power away, that sort of thing. So I
Right.
have folks identify that up front, and then I take them through what I call the heal process, and that is really identifying those wounded or impulsive reactions, and then seeing how they show up in their life, because that really is the wounded inner child, the lost inner child that's coming forth. And folks will have these reactions as adults, and I know that certainly was true for me.
Right.
And so I would react in a big way, or I would shut down more typically. And later I would say, why am I doing that? Why am I separating from myself
Right.
almost? And so that's what I have folks do. So they start out, going through this, identifying it, and then I have them go through some letter writing exercises, creating a timeline. So it's a very practical book because I wanted to write something that people could really take something away
Right.
from, that they could use.
It's interesting how much influence you've had on my life because you have been really generous with your thoughts, opinions, and suggestions. And plus, I keep an eye on you. It's always nice to see how you're doing. And I've never written a workbook, and I just finished writing my book, and it's published, the
Mm-hmm.
Codependency Revolution. And the next project for me is to write a workbook. And
Yeah,
so I have your workbook next to me
right.
to inspire me on
I appreciate that.
trying to find a way to take what I wrote
Right.
and make it jump off the pages and serve as a practical guide. And so, yes, I mean, I've read
Yeah.
both the book and the workbook, and I couldn't recommend it more.
And that's really key for folks because everything that I have in the book, probably just like yours, is in the workbook. But
Right.
what I did with the workbook is I expanded it, and part two of my workbook is all about codependency and taking folks through that. So it has like bonus material, but again, I wanted it to be very practical and approachable. And what I find is that like your books, they're very thought provoking. And so folks will read like a sentence or a paragraph and they're like, okay,
Right.
I had to put your book down. Right.
Yes, yes, yeah, it's really dense. If someone like says, "Yeah, I read your book just in like 1 or 2 nights," I'm going, I mean, you can do
Yeah.
it, but how can you read something that should make you stop and think and like
Yeah.
wonder, about your life? Thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate that observation and that compliment.
Yeah, and I agree. When people tell me I've seen them one week, I see them the next, they're like, okay, I read your book, like you were saying. I'm like, basically they've read the words, but they
Right.
haven't really the book is about moving out of the intellectual realm into the
Right.
heart-centered space.
You
And
know,
so that, of course, that's the harder, deeper work that most of us, at least at first, we resist because that's where the pain lives. But of
right.
course, that through that pain, we come to a healing place.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. When I first started talking about what would become the Human Magnet Syndrome book, I was traveling around giving trainings. And from the very beginning till even now, people said, "When are you going to write your book telling us what to do?" And I
Mm,
would say some version of the following that has actually um, become more clear to me is
mm,
you can't solve a problem if you don't know what it is.
mhm,
You can't solve a problem if you don't know where it comes from. You can't solve a problem if you don't know its impact on you. And so that information is crucial
mhm,
and in itself healing.
mhm,
Although I still have another book to write, but your books, on the other hand, you kind of um, approach it from a two-prong uh, point of view. You do a lot of, well, this is what it is. This is how I
mhm,
see it. This is
mhm,
how it might be helpful for you to consider it. And you're also very instructive. You have,
mhm.
and could you tell us, just to kind of move more towards your book, the part that fascinates me most is the way you conceptualize the inner trauma child. And that might not be the word you used, and I might be using my own, because my work and my self-love recovery treatment program is based upon the idea that codependency or self-love deficit disorder can't be solved unless we find its origins. And the origins are the attachment trauma in the child and the
Mhm.
work I do, inner trauma child. And I've had success at it. But you and I, uh, parallel, but you
Mhm.
go about it in a different way. And that's what really fascinates me. And I would love for you to tell my viewers, my listeners,
Mhm.
um, how you work with the client to identify this. What do you call it? Inner trauma child? What is your terminology?
Well, it's the lost inner child,
Lost inner, inner child.
to your point, what I like to begin with folks, and I last night I spoke to a group of 300 graduate students at
Yeah, that's
National
impressive.
Louis, and which was my great privilege and pleasure to really impart this knowledge. And what I say is that we come by our wounding honestly. And what I mean by that is that all of us grew up in our childhood families
Right,
and we adapted to that usually dysfunctional environment using a toolkit that was homegrown, that felt
right.
right to us. And so we created these tools to feel emotionally safe in our families. And so that becomes our wounded toolkit, our wounded responses. And
Interesting.
that then becomes these impulsive reactive responses as an
Right.
adult.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We have so many thoughts, beliefs, and ideas that are the same, but we just explain it differently. So I
Hmm.
would explain that as defense or coping mechanisms or strategies or
Hmm.
survival
Yeah,
strategies that helped us as a child in a traumatic environment that would morph into or manifest into our adult life.
right.
And and so when you identify um, that with your clients, well,
Yeah.
can you talk more about that
Yeah,
process?
certainly. So, my point that I'd like to emphasize is basically talking with folks about look how hard you were working to make this dysfunctional environment feel emotionally safe to you. And so it really is celebrating how hard they were working as a child, how hard you and I were working in our childhoods to make our complicated, dysfunctional home life
Yeah.
feel okay to us. And so we develop these wounded tools. And so it's about this sort of positive psychology on it,
Oh, yeah.
and then helping them folks find a sense of agency around that. So it's not so much that we're celebrating these wounded tools, but we're
No,
honoring how they helped in childhood, but they certainly don't help us in adulthood because those wounded tools are sort of time-stamped for a very specific time and place, and they don't translate well into adulthood. But of course, what do? We just pack all of them up, bring
Roy,
them into
talk
our
more
adult
about the
life.
timestamp thing. Just a little bit more, because that I think there's something really important in that, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
And then of course continue.
So what I mean by time stamped is that our wounding gets frozen in time,
Hmm.
um, for related to a specific event. So it could be something big happened at 8 years old, and that's what I call an emotional standout. And then that 8 years old becomes the age of wounding that sort of encapsulates that time. And
Yeah,
then, for instance, I'm working with someone, and they act out by sneaking around and going and buying cigarettes that their spouse doesn't want them to.
right.
And so I asked this person, well, okay, so about how old, that doesn't sound like an adult response. So how old are you when you do? He's like, oh, I'm 17.
Oh, that's
I'm sneaking
impressive.
around. My mom doesn't want me to smoke, so I'm doing this anyway. And so right then we have this like wounded process that he's reenacting, as an adult, but it's
Mm,
not conscious. It's all automatic. And so what we're doing is kind of bringing this to the forefront. We're then able to now interact with this in real time. And so when this person goes and buys cigarettes, what I want him to do is to sort of like realize, okay, what am I doing? Do I really want to do this? So we're trying to bring some recognition to
mm,
that, to bring it out of this frozen state
mhm.
where it's just on rinse and repeat into a more conscious state. So moving from a impulsive reactor to a conscious creator.
One of the things, first of all, that's fascinating and brilliant. And one of the things that most impressed me is the way you reframe it
Mhm.
with an understanding that at and these are my words, not yours. So if I'm not getting it, let me know. But with an understanding that at the core is shame, and
Yeah,
and and that's my understanding of how I look at it. But they already are shame based,
yeah,
and and their reenactment of their coping strategies they learned as a child
yeah,
are actually dysfunctional as an adult. You reframe it so they don't. I just the way you reframe it is brilliant, because you're not suggesting there's something wrong with them. This
right,
is a mistake,
right.
or, or even nicely worded a mental health condition, but a failed attempt at trying to survive and to
Mhm.
do something over and over again that goes back to the childhood.
Yeah.
And how do your clients react to that?
Thank you, Ross, for that reflection. So what you see when we do this more positive psychology moment, you see them sort of then easing into, oh, I come by my wounding honestly. So there's a gentleness. So like you said, so much of this is rooted in a shame. And so
Mhm.
what I'm trying to get them out of is this, recycling that shame into a place of agency, into a place of feeling empowered and honoring. So it's moving away from that, because if they stay in that shame place, then they're going to stay in a victim space.
Right.
And that just then repeating all of this wounded stuff from before. So it's gently reframing and honoring. And so I'm teaching them how to really be gentle with themselves. I'm teaching them about self-regulation. And so in
Mhm.
the middle of a session, they'll be like plowing through a story, and they'll be all like emotionally activated, and I'll say, let's just take a minute. Let's just breathe, you
Right.
know, because the trauma child has learned to just put up with all of that and to plow through it and to have your shortened, breath and sort of brace for impact. And so in this work, what we're doing is we're teaching the self-regulation. Let's just take a moment.
One real quick comment, then please continue. So what I'm hearing you say with regard to self-regulation, it's making me think that there's kind of a fight or flight response. Something's going on in an environment. They're trying to solve it, and they're doing it harmfully either to themselves or others, and they're um,
Mhm.
triggered, activated,
Yeah, activated.
and, and so you're helping with self-regulation. And what I picture, and tell me if maybe tell me what you think. It's that there's kind of this reaction of I got to fix it. I get it right. There's going to be a consequence or a fight or flight thing. And you help them kind of calm down, get centered, and come up with a better way of doing it. I don't
Mhm.
know if that's an oversimplification.
No, that's perfect. So it really is, when folks come in and they're telling me about their childhood families and that sort of age of wounding time, that's that emotion that's frozen and stuck. And then they're basically now in the movie, and they're
Yeah,
telling
I
me
like that.
about the movie, right? They're feeling
Absolutely.
it.
Yeah.
They're triggered and activated, and their amygdala is like fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. What do I do? And so that's when I'm like, let's just stop for a minute,
Yeah.
because that's their trauma wounding that
Yeah.
basically that's now in my office. So now we're in it. And what I'm doing is today we can do some self-regulation,
Hmm.
because when growing up as children, we didn't have these abilities to self-regulate. It was about survival.
Right.
And so that's what we're doing in session now, is we're saying, no, you don't have to be in survival mode. And that helps the inner child then to calm down, and
Right.
then it helps that person to be more present.
It's interesting. We do the same and we do it so differently.
Hmm.
Uh, um, a simple way to explain what I do in my healing the inner trauma child work or hitch work is I, and I'm going to simplify it because I don't want to detract the importance of you talking about your work, but is to be able to bring someone back to the memories of the trauma,
Hmm.
and in that connecting to the trauma child, the inner
Hmm.
trauma child, the inner wounded child, and then interact in that moment as who
Hmm.
they are and the child. And in that process, kind of do what you're doing,
Yeah.
through the self-regulation. It's another way that they're actually going back in time. And I don't know if you saw me smile when you said the movie, because
Hmm.
you got it, is to go back in time, to flash back it. And the I
Right.
call it the 3D
Yeah.
4K memory of
Right.
trauma. And and that in itself is self-regulating. And so it's fascinating how you have created um, uh, a way to get people to understand the essence and the origin of the problem for which they're struggling, trace
Hmm.
it back to the child, and help them in real time,
Hmm.
almost simultaneously, that the manifestation of them and the child relax, chill, and make adult decisions, not the decisions that you called and refer to more of. And these are my words, but you had your own way of saying it, coping or survival skills from their childhood. And so, and how do your clients react to that? How does that work from there?
Well, I think a lot of them are grateful because what we're doing is we're honoring how hard they were working as children,
Hmm.
and they're able to see within a short time. So your listeners are probably, recalling some things that have happened in their childhood, and so
Right.
it's like what we're doing is we're bringing that into the consciousness. And so when we are more consciously aware, then we can own it, we can claim it, we can name it, and that really begins the healing journey. And so now when
Integration, right? Is that
what's that?
integration? Is that
Yeah.
integration?
Yeah, that's what we're working towards is like what I call integration.
Hmm.
So it's where we're all where we feel connected, but that's through a series of conversations, through exercises, through letter writing that I have folks do back and forth, just ways to connect with that wounded, that lost inner child, so that they're understanding everything that they've carried from childhood into adulthood. And the biggest thing that makes the difference is really boundaries,
Boundaries.
because teaching boundaries is now we're giving a tool, a functional tool, that because you and I'll just say myself, I don't want to speak for you. So for
You
myself,
can, you know me well enough.
but I really didn't have any boundaries
Right.
as a kid, right? I
Mhm.
was catering to my mom and dad, and I was, okay, what do you need from me, sort of thing. And so when we teach boundaries and we use boundaries as an adult, and we're setting boundaries with people, we're saying no, we're doing those sorts of things, then our wounded inner child will look at us and say, okay, he's going to protect all of us. Because if you think about it, the wounded, that wounding gets activated, and that lost inner child steps in front of us and starts driving the bus. But when we start to set boundaries
Right.
consistently, then that's how we're protecting ourselves, because we didn't have that as kids, and now
Right.
we have that as adults. And so that's the pivot point.
Interesting. When I first wrote the human magnet syndrome, and I explained, that there's a reason why we're always attracted to the same type of person, and I traced it back to the codependent, or who I now call self-love deficient. It's
Mhm.
attached the trauma that we're talking about, and what you're reminding me is it's the replication of
Mhm.
the trauma is doing what you only know how to do through experience,
Mhm.
is to fight it in a certain way, and that becomes what's familiar, and what is familiar therefore is paradoxically safe. And so what I'm hearing you say is you help them identify the dysfunctional reactions of what they're doing now that's based on the past, so that
Mhm.
they can make better decisions.
Yeah,
And um, and it sounds like they hear it, they recognize it, and they make progress.
very much so. Because especially when we get to talking about boundaries and getting into that, because then they have some tools that they can use in the real world.
Right.
And so they feel much more powerful, and they feel like they don't have to reenact all these wounded responses with all these people who are disrespectful and not honoring of their boundaries, because they can say, no, this I'm really feeling hurt by the way you talk to me. So then just by that really gives this sense of strength and
Right.
empowerment.
So what I'm hearing you say is that it is now the adult, the healing,
Yeah.
becoming integrated adult, is now making the decisions. Now is in real time. In real time, I think you used another term for it, is setting boundaries or understanding boundaries in a way that's reflective of good mental health, not what they learned through coping. Bob, this sounds like a really good book for you to write.
Yeah, I should.
Yeah. Well, yeah,
Well,
yeah.
I have.
Tell us more about You Should.
But boundaries are really, really key.
Yeah, your understanding and boundaries, it fascinates me because it's like you're talking about it, the boundaries in the past, thinking the boundaries here and now, and
Mhm.
how it impacts your future mental health. Yeah,
Yeah.
I love the way you integrate boundaries and healing the inner. Again, I'm using my terms, it's same as yours. I just can't remember it as easily.
Well,
Remember
you're
mine.
right, and it's a very boundaries are a very important topic for me and for the work that I do. And so I am writing a book on boundaries.
Oh,
I don't quite know when that's going to be coming out. I'm just in the
oh,
process of writing the manuscript, but that's how important it is for our healing, because that wounded part is going to be in the wings, watching us, watching the adult self.
mhm,
And if at any time that adult self loses that consistent boundaries, that's when all that wounding is going to come back
right.
because we know it so well. It's sort of like imprinted deeply in us. So that's why consistent boundaries are really important. I mean, I call myself a codependent in recovery. And
Mhm,
what I mean by that is that every day I have to practice my boundary skills,
right.
right?
It's,
Because that's keeping me in a healthy place.
I read somewhere, I love this saying, problem with boundaries with codependents or people who are self-love deficient is they don't know where they begin and where they end.
William.
They're so early on through their um, inner trauma child or is that to survive in an environment where one parent is pathologically narcissistic
Mhm.
and not to be a focal point for abuse, neglect, they have to find a way to become the person the narcissist needs, which means
Right.
pliable, moldable, invisible.
Mhm.
And they never get to learn about boundaries. They don't know where
Mhm.
they begin and where they end.
That's
And
right.
so not only do you identify that, but you help them do what should have happened.
Mhm.
They had good healing parents, which is
Mhm.
why so many people think of good psychotherapy as almost has a little bit to do with reparenting.
Mhm. Mhm. Well,
Interesting.
yeah, and so through our work, I'm teaching them basically, just as you do, how to reparent themselves
Mhm.
and how to give to themselves what they didn't receive in childhood. Because that's what we need to do in our adulthood is give to ourselves what we didn't receive in childhood. That's what helps us to become fully actualized, to become integrated.
I know in my own therapy, I can see that my therapist actually gets what you're talking about and helps me understand my reactions to people that aren't
Hmm.
always productive. Either they're self-sabotaging or
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
she'll ask me, is this little Rossi? Is this
Right,
Rossi or is
right,
this Ross? And I'll
right.
go, damn. It's like, damn, that's Ross. I'm because I was like the angry, you can't mess with me. And then would and my codependency as an adult was more active
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
I would like recognize it and kind of then she would go do a version of what you're doing.
Yeah.
And I'd be able to see, oh yeah, yeah, there's other ways to set boundaries that aren't reflective of this hurt little child. And it
Hmm.
sounds like you do that really well with your clients.
And you're doing some great work right
Well,
there.
I try.
You're
I
you're
mean, I
helping.
mean,
Yeah.
well, I mean, it's probably a whole podcast subject, but how could you, me, or any other therapist that aspires to be good
Right.
help people if they can't figure themselves out first?
Well, that's so true. And we can only take folks as far as we have traveled,
Exactly.
right? So we have to do our own work so we can create a safe container for others to be with us.
That is why your book and my book and people like us, which
Yeah.
other people that contribute to the mental health field and our society at large, um, resonate to both um, psychotherapists, mental health
Mhm.
practitioners,
Mhm.
anyone who's in the helping professions,
Yeah.
because many of them, and I'll speak for myself and a decent amount of people I know and respect, we come to this field as wounded,
Mhm.
and we can't see in others what we can't see in ourselves.
That's right.
And so the way that I think of what you do is help people discover a new point of view for why they do or don't do things.
That's exactly right. So we're just helping them to look at themselves in a with a gentle gaze, right?
I
And,
love your terminology.
and
Oh my gosh.
to look
Yeah,
to
a
look at
gentle
themselves
gaze. I
with
love it.
look at the wounding, look at the time growing up with a loving detachment
Right.
that they can now hold space for this within themselves and have a gentleness, because that's probably the biggest thing that I see with folks is that a lot of people really beat up on themselves, and it's again going back to that shaming,
Yeah.
and they feel so bad because they recognize that their life screwed up and their relationships are screwed up, and they feel very lost in it. But when we begin to heal and understand that this is all a natural byproduct
Right.
of growing up in a dysfunctional home,
Right.
and you come by your wounding honestly, and there's a way out of this maze.
Say more about honestly. You've said that several times, and I need to understand that more. And what do you mean by honestly? Because it seems to me like it's an important concept, and I'm just at the precipice, I think, of getting it. So tell me more about what you
So
mean.
how I mean by that is that all of these codependent self-love deficit disorder tools that I learned as a child,
Right.
like shutting down, making my mom and dad, what their needs were more important than my own. Learning to really be quiet and to watch my mom and dad's expression and change myself. Um, so all of those different things, no one sat me down and said, Bobby, this is how you do it.
Okay.
So it was just me coming up with, okay, I guess I need to be really good, because in my egocentric childlike logic, I determined that if I was good and did everything they said, that they wouldn't argue. All
So
right. So I developed that on my own.
the narrative, if I
So that
disappear,
was an honest assessment that I made. And I said, okay, this is what I need to do to keep myself safe. So I was trying to control and manage the household, right?
right.
And so this is what I was going to do. Of
Okay.
course, it didn't work, and they still argued. They weren't arguing about me, but I didn't know that, because as kids, we're great observers, but we're
Yeah.
really poor interpreters.
So bringing it back to where you started is you help people understand in a self-psychology way, and
Mhm.
that's your thing. It's not mine. So if I mistakenly refer to something, please let me know. But you help people know in a supportive, um, non-threatening, non-judgmental way that you're doing the best you can,
Mhm.
and it's rooted from when you did the best you can, but you were a child, and how
Yeah.
could you know better? Because you
Right.
lived in a
Right.
either a non-nurturing, unsafe
Yeah.
environment, and now it's time to like come to it honestly. So now I get it.
And
Yeah,
see how that
yeah,
changes the narrative.
yeah.
Right? Because now I'm no longer working off of this narrative that I'm bad and I'm screwed up. I'm now working off this narrative that I really was trying really hard to
Right.
figure out this complicated family dynamic. And I was giving it my honest best.
Yes, and that unfortunately is the double bind of being, it's the insanity of, and I say, okay, for those who are podcasts, they can't see my air quotes. The insanity of being self-love deficient or codependent is you're just trying to survive and stay
Mhm.
and keep from being hurt, or experiencing consequences and make someone happy. But what you don't realize is, because in my terminology, because of the human magnet syndrome, you're
Yeah.
probably with someone who's got a personality disorder, and they're pretty much in some way replicating what happened to you as a child.
Mhm.
And there's really no opportunity to figure it out in that relationship. And so
Mhm.
you kind of pull them out and just help them understand their own, honestly, effectively, authentically, where these coping mechanisms, where these attempts to be safe started.
Mhm.
Help them not be judgmental, help them accept themselves, and
Mhm.
then grow up in a sense through what you teach them in your book.
Right. Yeah.
And because we have to wrap up, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are about what I said, and then I'd love for you to talk just a little bit more about why people need to get your book. What type of person needs to read your book, and for what reason?
Mm. Well, I do want to say some things before I go into that. And I really encourage folks to learn more self-regulation skills, especially if
Yes.
you have a traumatic past. I encourage you to learn some breathing techniques. It could be just
Mhm.
taking a big belly breath and helping to kind of bring more air into your system. I encourage people to look into tapping, which is emotional freedom techniques, and
Mhm.
that taps into our energy meridian system, and that will help to de-escalate, especially if you are really activated and spun up. So these are things that I wish that I had learned as a child,
Yeah.
that I know now and that I teach now, because we didn't have these skills, most of us as children, and
Well,
we
we,
were
we
in
would have
this.
needed to be taught them, and of course we
Yeah,
didn't have
we were just in this very activated, shoulders up,
survival.
short breath, survival mode sort of thing. And that's what so many of us carried into adulthood, and we keep replicating that over and over.
Mm.
So as far as you know, my book is really geared for adults, but I do have older teenagers now reading the
That's
book,
interesting.
and so they're bringing in that information now, but it really applies to anyone. So I wrote it with men and women in mind. I have folks in their 80s who are reading this book, and they'll say, I'm too old." I'm like, "Well, you don't know how long you're going to live, so would you rather be happier in the rest of your time?" That
Yeah,
sort of thing. So it works for any age. I
yeah,
encourage folks to really take their time with it. Don't rush through it. And
right.
and really, each of the exercises works is built on the last. And so it's a
Mm.
cumulative effect.
That's
And
yeah, that's what I like about it. It's very
yeah.
progressive. It's very linear.
Right. And it's a deepening work.
Yes.
So as you go through it, so the exercises seem really simple, but what they are is they're helping you to go deeper within yourself, because what I'm teaching in my work, what you teach in your work and through the book, is the art of introspection.
Hmm.
So we're helping people to understand and
Hmm.
communicate with themselves on a much deeper, heartfelt level.
Wow. Very well said. Very well said. Um, our time just kind of blew by.
Mhm.
And you and I always we always say the same thing when we're done recording. Well, we could have gone another half an hour,
Yep.
but that means we'll just have to do another, and since I exaggerate, our 20th one. But no, and seriously, this was enjoyable, and I think the people out there, whether they know you or not, are going to benefit greatly from your point of view, your perspectives, and your healing direction and advice. So
Thank
thank you
you.
for your
Thank you,
work.
Ross. Thank you for
Yeah,
saying that. And my book can be found on Amazon, Healing Your Lost Inner Child, Healing Your Wounded Relationship, and The Tender Path of Grief and Loss.
yes.
And
Oh,
they're all a Kindle, paperback, and audiobook.
yep. He's out there, guys. There's no coincidence that he's selling his book so well, because you are speaking a language that resonates with people and showing them a path that is loving and positive and nurturing. So
Mhm.
I'm proud to have you as a friend, and thank you for today.
Thank you, Ross. My
You
pleasure.
take, we'll do this again soon. Bye bye, Bob.
Great.